Shalom, and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
Hello to anyone who might be listening to this on the Temple Beth Am podcast series. Let's jump into it. I have us having finished the verse and the Rashi in verse 43. Verses 43 through 47 or 8 sort of are a unit. We will not do them all as a unit, but you could study this without doing Rashi and just kind of learn all of those verses together, because they're all talking about the delineations of who can and who can't, and who is obligated and who is prohibited from eating Korban Pesach, which the Torah is really setting up as a integral, central, critical annual ritual, that it's as severe as to how important it is to do it if you're obligated to, and how prohibited you are from doing it if you can't, right? There's no in-between in Korban Pesach. So it might be interesting when we're done with those verses to pull back and look at all of them, but we're going to do our normal pace, looking at them word for word with a Rashi commentary. So let me read verse 43 again, just to get us going into the theme. Verse 43 began not the parsha in the sense of the next parsha in the weekly reading, but the next section in the scroll, because there's a parsha break after verse 42. Vayomer Adonai al Moshe, God said to Moses via Aaron and to Aaron, Zot chukat haPasach. This is the law of the Pesach, and the Pesach means to the sacrifice, not to the holiday. Kol ben nechar, any person who is foreign on some level, and reminded that Onkelos translated that as someone who is not like who was born an Israelite, a Hebrew, but has foreignized himself or herself by having become an apostate. He translated it as Diyish Tamad, someone who became a Mishumad. Lo yochal bo, you cannot eat of it. Right? The simple pshat seems to be different than what Onkelos is saying. Simple pshat means to say this is only for Jews. Onkelos seems to be saying this is only for Jews who believe, right? And who have not taken themselves so far away from the community that they can no longer be amongst the community of believers. That's a very fraught thing, right? If we were having a sort of a class on Jewish sociology and where the boundaries of the tent are, that would be interesting to discuss. We're studying the verse, but Onkelos is understanding it that way. Remember, Onkelos himself was a convert, right? So it's interesting for him to translate this verse rather frumly, right? Rather exclusionary, right? That even if you were a born Jew, if he's basically saying, if you're not still holding to the ideas and the commitments that I chose to do, you're out, right? You're out of this ritual. Okay. Let's jump into verse 44. Rebecca Menash, do you want to read verse 44 of V'chol Eved?
Try, yeah.
Let's give Rebecca a microphone.
Yeah. וכל עבד איש מקנת כסף ומלתה אותו, אז יאכל בו. So every slave, I assume miknat kesef is that was purchased with money? Or
Right.
So it's every slave, man, or I don't know if man or just human, that is bought with money.
Right. The trup can help you with the parsing if the trup is correct, right? That the chol eved ish is in conjunctive trup. So
Okay.
any slave of an ish,
ish.
It's in smichut.
Okay. So every slave of a I assume an ish from Israel that was bought with money and was circumcised.
Correct.
Then they can eat from it.
Good. Okay. So the vocab words in this verse are not so complicated. How to put them together and what rule is being taught may or may not be obvious. Seems to say that if there is an Eved Ish, a servant slave owned by a person, a Hebrew, meaning owned by a Hebrew, miknat kaseb, and it was a full purchase, right? And, we might be squeamish about that, but that's just the way the society operated back then. Umalta oto. And it's interesting what form malta is, because malta looks
Female.
feminine. It's hard to know what the subject of the verb malta oto is. Who's the she who would have circumcised him? Right? Just a question, right? Umalta oto seems to be, and she will circumcise him, because it looks like a past tense verb. It's vav ha'ipuch, so it's in the future. Right. Az yochal bo. Then he can eat of it. Okay. This may or may not seem obvious. So if it seems obvious, then it's going to sound like a silly question. What is the primary rule you think is being taught in this verse in simple English?
That if you circumcise your slave, they become they're allowed to eat.
Right.
So they're Jewish.
So we could be seeing in this verse kind of a precursor to what we think of as conversion, right? You brought, let's take the purchasing out of it. You've brought someone who's not part of the Israelite tribe into your domicile, into your world, into your community, right? They're new, they're not inside. And Pesach is coming. Well, if they're still in that outside category, when we have this very, very internal ritual coming up, they're on the outside. But if you circumcise him, right, meaning if the person is choosing to say, I want in, and they're willing to give up something to do so, sure, have them join your chabara, right? Anyone have a different altered understanding of what the simple rule is? We have a lot of hands, so let's go around. Marshall?
So two things. Number one, the Fox translation is if you have circumcised him, which is interesting, the interesting use of the vav ha'ipuch here.
Right.
Right. And the second one is
if by the time Pesach comes, it's almost like super perfect, you will have circumcised him by then.
Right.
Then, go ahead.
Right. And the altered translation is, and every man's slave purchased with silver, comma, you shall circumcise, comma, then shall he eat of it.
Aha. So instead of going it to be an if-then, it's you got to circumcise them, right? The result of the circumcision is that they can eat, but alter seems to be translating it to say the verse is actually commanding the circumcision, which is subtly different than saying commanding the servant not being able to eat until he's circumcised. Okay, Sue?
There's two things. One, there's that mixed multitude from a couple of verses ago, and these people are part of this mixed multitude. But there's something else that's sort of hovering to me, and that is that here they are being redeemed from slavery, and somehow they need to leave Egypt and become one and become a people and not become stratified with slave owners and slaves. They sort of have to adopt everyone as a people and leave this whole, those are your of day ish kind of thing.
So someone could hear that and say that it might be too rosy colored a set of glasses. It's beautiful, right? Because someone could have the opposite argument. Wait a second. We're talking about freed slaves purchasing slaves and whether or not the purchased slaves can eat of your dinner, right? It reminds me of who is here on the trip to the South. Carl, were you on the trip on that trip? The most interesting thing I saw on the trip to the South, and I'm sure I mentioned this before, was in the Museum of Southern Jewish Life in New Orleans, which was a fascinating museum. There was a whole exhibit, I don't know if it's a permanent exhibit, on the Civil War and the Jews of the Civil War on both sides, right? And there was a very well preserved, a diary entry by a Civil War general who was writing from somewhere in Mississippi in 1862, 1863, so proud that he had been able to procure matzahs for his Jewish, he was a Jewish general, for his Jewish soldiers in midst of war. He was a Confederate general. So he was fighting to perpetuate enslavement and was celebrating his ability to allow his soldiers to celebrate this freedom, the Festival of Freedom, right? So one could say, wait a second, this is sort of bizarre, right? That you're maintaining the institution of purchasing a person for enslavement and then only allowing him to eat dinner with you once he's been sliced, right? So, but so far everyone's in agreement that that's the basic rule. Let's go around. right? Ilan and then Tova.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. It's what's not clear to me is when they say then he may eat of it, which he are they talking about? Are they talking about he, the slave owner, or he, the slave?
Wonderful, right? Wonderful in the sense that sometimes the ambiguity of Hebrew pronouns, and not only Hebrew pronouns, verbs that don't require the pronoun, make us wonder as to who the subject is, because the yochal bo could be, as we heard already from the other side of the table, the purchased slave, or maybe your not having yet circumcised your outsiders prevents you, the owner. Maybe there's something about you, the owner, who cannot participate in this festival until everyone in your realm has been brought in. And that might be leaning a little bit more in the direction that you were saying, Sue, that this is a night of no outsiders. And if you've still got outsiders among you, not only can they not eat, you can't eat. Maybe. We'll get into that when we get to Rashi.
So actually,
yeah, please.
The second thought, which is this saying that, for example, we have non-Jews at our Seder, some of who may or may not be circumcised. I haven't checked. But does that mean that we are somehow violating the law by including them in the ritual?
Right. So my short answer to that, aside from saying my sister is available to attend any Pesach Seder and make everyone be eligible by the time the meal begins. I mean, she's a mohelet, yeah. I mean, I would say no and no, right? That first of all, we don't know if that's what the verse means, right? We don't know if the verse is saying that who is the one who cannot eat, and we're not sure if the verse is saying it's actually a positive obligation to circumcise them, as opposed to just a rule saying that if they're not circumcised, they can't eat from the Pesach offering. But more important than that, we have rules for our Pesach Seder, right? But a lot of what we're doing is symbolic, and one of the things we're not doing is eating Korban Pesach, right? When you look at the shank bone or the chicken neck or the grilled tofu on your Seder plate, it's zecher lemikdash. It's in memory and homage to the mikdash, but it does not mean that all the rules that would have applied had we actually been living in temple times and actually eating Korban Pesach apply today. Now, if I wanted to push the issue and I said, if the Mashiach were to come tomorrow, right, and the third temple would be built, and Pesach 2026, we'd be all of a sudden obligated, if we lived in Jerusalem, to eat Korban Pesach, I might say maybe, right? Maimonides, who we're going to look at if we get time today, his Code of Jewish Law, the Mishnah Torah, which was written in the 1170s, 80s, 90s, was interesting in that he wrote it 1,000 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. But unlike all the other medieval codes, he writes it as if the temple still stood, meaning he is as precise and as comprehensive about all the rules of the sacrificial system as he is for all the rules of prayer, which replaces the sacrificial system. And his rationale was essentially, Shiach could come tomorrow, and my community needs to know what to do. So it would be interesting. I didn't look up this particular halacha. If the Rambam opined on that issue, that if the temple were to be built, is this actually practical law? That either you, the owner, or you, the Eved, cannot be present and eat unless there's been a circumcision. Stevie, and then Tova, and then Norm, and then Marshall, and then Larry, and then Bill, and then Barry, and then Class will be over.
I'm not certain that the Eved here is a non-Israelite, right? Especially if the previous verse were willing to interpret as an Israelite who, removes themselves from the community. You can imagine that if you're the servant of a human instead of the servant of God, then there's a problem with you participating. And they're saying, okay, so if you're the servant of a human, well, at least if you're circumcised, then you have recognized some sort of divine, overarching, hegemony, and, therefore you're included. And the obviously we're going to get to various non-Jews also in this paragraph, but non-Israelites, I should say. But yeah, certainly it seems plausible to read this as not being a mode of conversion.
Yeah, good, Stevie. So how about this? It's certainly not implausible because the Torah has categories of Eved Ivri, the Hebrew servant slave, and Eved Knani, the non-Hebrew one, and it's just not explicit which one is here. My instinct as to why it's not that is why would there be a havamina, an assumption in the Torah that all of a sudden you've got an Eved Ivri who happens not to be circumcised? Right, like, because it's not saying if your child isn't circumcised, they can't eat it, or if your friend in the chavurah, because the assumption would be, I would think, that if the person is an ivri, they'd be circumcised. So why that would have to be put in, I'm not sure. But you're right that it's not clear in the verse itself if this person who's been acquired by money is an ivri. And again, we don't even know what that meant then, right? It wasn't the maternal line. It wasn't, is your great grandmother Jewish? Right, so we're not even sure what that even would have meant in context, right? Tova.
I'm reflecting on the translation the translation of Onkelos, which
Of the previous verse.
on the previous verse,
Yeah.
right? That that suggests that the person. I'm sorry,
It's fine.
my mind. Let me refresh. I was waiting a long time.
The Bendechar, the foreigner.
To a lot of other ideas. So there shall be no alien there for every man. Shall be no alien. Okay. That that Onkelos is saying that the person who may have been born Jewish and regarded as born as a Jew into the Jewish community, but who has rejected that identity, the apostate, basically, that person is not a Jew, whereas then the next verse has a purchased slave with no suggestion of his will or consent, nonetheless becomes able to eat it by circumcision. That's not of his will. So those two seem opposite.
Yeah, or they seem opposite, or they certainly seem paired. Right?
They seem paired, yeah.
Right. That if you were in by dint of your identity and you chose to go out, you're out. And if you were out, we can sort of make you in. And there's the Mechilta, from which Rashi is going to quote, has a long section as to whether or not this can be done bal korcho, against the Eved's will.
Right. Yeah.
Right? There are privileges to this, apparently, but that doesn't mean it's the right thing to force the person into it. And that goes back to the question is the umalta oto, and if you circumcise him, you can eat, or is it you've got to circumcise him? Right? That's what Alter's translating at the latter. Right? Barry, Norm, we'll keep going around.
A few different comments. One, this discussion of who is a slave, or what the different kinds of slave. There's a slave that is purchased, but we Israelites in Egypt, we were not purchased slaves. We were free people who were enslaved to do whatever we had to do, but we still owned our property. We had cattle, we had things of our own, including our slaves. So we were not purchased slaves as the two kinds of slaves. Another comment. I was reading the Mechilta on this subject before class started, and there are different schools of opinion. And one opinion is that it's the slave who may eat or not eat. And as Rabbi, you mentioned, the other opinion school is so long as anyone in that household is not circumcised, the household prevents the master from eating the Pesach.
Right. We'll look at that when we get to
later. Later, okay. That's enough.
Norm?
I want to focus on a slightly different side of things, and that is what exactly it means to be circumcised. To most of us, we assume that this means a Jewish ritual circumcision. But what if one acquires a slave who happens to be circumcised, whether it was done for medical or social reasons or for purposes of some non-Jewish religion? And nowadays, if somebody's being converted as an adult, or somebody, even I believe even a baby who's born naturally circumcised, why the moil will come and they'll take a pinprick of bread that they can still dab and hold up and say "Dum bris," and that stands in lieu of circumcision. But I don't know if they had any concept of that at the time, and so we have this issue of what if the slave just happens to be circumcised.
Right. Well, Rashi's going to mention that on the next verse, right? As to the different ways in which, I don't need that one, and the different ways in which someone may or may not be circumcised. And you're right that to this day, if someone comes to conversion already medically circumcised, they are required. You call it a pinprick. We call it usually a prick. In order for that ritual to have been done for the purpose of Jewish sanctity. Let's keep going around, and we'll see, because there have been a lot of hands that have been waiting. So Larry, go.
A third thing is that I had the mic. The slave had the ability for 12 months to refuse circumcision, and after that 12-month period, if still refusing, the master has no choice but to sell that slave to a non-Jew. But so long as that uncircumcised slave chooses not to be circumcised, the master is prevented from eating the Pesach.
Larry?
First of all, your comment reminds me of an old joke, the punchline of which is, no, Nurse Jones, I told you to prick his boil. But speaking of jokes, there are comedians.
It'll become a suitcase.
And you can tell me who it is. One of the most famous ones is the comic who talks about if Jews had trees for Pesach.
Elon Gold.
Right. So I'm going to ask us to step back, as I often do, and look at this parsha, this section here, as a whole. And it reminds me of that. It's kind of funny. And it's really funny, especially when we get to the end. We never do this. And I know this is a choice. But I mean, it seems to me we miss something when we're looking at each individual verse. We're like the men in the elephant, the blind man in the elephant.
Yeah.
And we're not stepping back and looking to see what the arc of this story or this section happens to be.
Right.
Clearly inserted for me, that the author wanted to insert some laws here that we haven't even addressed, the laws of slavery. Barry's right. We don't even know what a slave is in this particular, up to here. The Jews haven't been given, the Hebrews haven't been given the laws of slavery. And it makes it very clear at the end, and the Israelites did as the Lord had charged. And it happened on this very day, in verse 51. On this very day. In other words, as they're struggling to get ready to leave, they're sitting around discussing, okay, who can eat, who can't eat, what happens if you don't.
Our art scroll Hilchos Pesach on the night of Pesach.
I find it to be kind of comical. I mean, maybe I'll do a stand-up routine about this one day. And this business about circumcision, which comes in over and over and over again as being something to be done for the entire community. We've had this already in Bereshit, when Shimon and Levi want Shechem to be able to circumcise all his people, so we already know that this is part of what's going on. But there's all sorts of other bizarre stuff going on here. I just want to read a little bit from Chizkuni, who says it has to do with he says the reason why this is a repeat, I'm not sure what it's a repeat of, is to tell us there's no waiting period after circumcision. If for some reason the foreskin grew back, such a slave is not disqualified from eating it on Passover. Wow. I mean, that's just, we're really going into all sorts of detailed stuff here that in the arc of the Exodus and of this particular story, seems to me it has to do with what Sue was talking about in some meta sense, who are these people who have left, and how do we categorize it? But the perspective is a perspective from a long time after the action that's actually happening here.
Yeah, no, it's very helpful comment. And you're right, Larry, that we lose when we go this letter by letter, and we gain, right? And you also lose, you also gain and lose if you only do the pullback. And so I'm certainly interested in the pullback occasionally, because sometimes it is important to just see the full context of a section, not just what a particular letter means. One thing you said triggered an idea about circumcision, right? So on the one hand, oops, what happened to my, sorry. On the one hand, it's sort of a brutal and chosen or forced entree into our peoplehood, right? Other hand, particularly as you think of the way the verb lamul is used not only for skin but for heart, umal et levavecha, right? That every Jew is supposed to be doing that as well. Think about what circumcision is. It's basically saying it's not that you don't have enough, but you have extra. You have something blocking you from something important and critical. But if we remove it, what's actually inside is core, pure, and exactly as it should be. So in some ways, the message to the outsider is not you're insufficient to be a part of us. Just we have to remove a layer. There's a layer of skin, and then there's a layer of identity or a layer of external concepts. But if we just chip away at it, you've already got a Jew inside of you. It's an interesting way of thinking about what circumcision means. You have it. We just have to expose it, right? And both in the flesh and in the heart. And I would say that that's probably a good reminder to all of us all the time, right? As we wonder, as we stray, as we add things to who we are, because we're constantly adding things to our, which is not a bad thing. As we read, as we learn, as we explore, we are piling on sometimes things that might be blocking the core, which is our relationship with the Holy One. But it's there. Sometimes you just gotta slice it off. Okay, Bill, and then Sue, and then Marshall.
Related to what Norm said, for those Hebrews that left amongst the mixed multitude during the initial Exodus that did not observe the very first Pesach, would they have to be recircumcised by drawing a drop of blood before they could participate in the second Pesach?
Yeah. Keep that mic here, Sue, then Marshall.
Two things. One, that Elon Gold bit about the Christmas tree. He was here recently. I don't know if anybody else was at that show. It was at the Wilson. No.
He did it with Elon, with Modi, and with
Correct.
Yeah.
And nobody was in the show. And he updated the Christmas tree bit with a few extra jokes, which were hilarious. And I had tears in my eyes.
He had a kid in Noah's Shall Have It class.
Yeah. Anyway, so go look for Christmas Tree 2.0. And what you just said, that, in essence, everybody's got a Jew inside of them. And all you have to do is kind of layer it. I really like that image. I like it, especially for the current anti-Semites. I think that would just, that's great. And it's made me think about Michelangelo, and there's a stone, and you chip away at it until you reveal that in what is inside the marble.
Yeah.
And that just had me kind of, ruminating to mention.
Every anti-Semite is a closeted Jew. Marshall.
I had to leave actually last week about 20 minutes early. And I don't know if Larry read the altar on verse 43, which I think is an introduction to the whole thing.
Okay, go ahead.
Where altar says, basically, this is no foreigner shall eat of it. The Exodus story defines the nation. The Passover ritual, which commemorates that story, is a cultic enactment of membership in the nation. Right. I think that's sort of, for me at least, gives us an understanding as to why we're starting with verse 43. And now we're going to say, how do you define membership in the nation? The first thing, for males to be circumcised.
Do any of the translations that you have make any interesting sense of the malta as a feminine verb? I'm thinking actually, I wonder if I was actually setting us down the wrong way, because maybe it's, yeah, I think what it probably is umalta, you male singular, and there's a hey at the end, but it's not a grammatical hey, right? Like v'katavta, v'achalta, v'savata uverachta, and there's a hey there, but it's probably not she, it's probably you, male singular, which I think wonder maybe why Alter reads it as a command, that you have an ish that you've purchased, umalta oto, circumcise that one, you must. And after that, he can eat a bit. Right? Not necessarily, because umal at levavecha, there's no yud there. In different forms, I think it's actually a 2-letter root, not a 3-letter root. Even though in the noun there's a yud in the word milah. Why the hey is there, I'm not sure, but it's probably, I don't know of any rendering that reads it feminine, even though it looks to the naked eye as feminine. Yeah.
And I saw reference that female slaves needed to have a mikvah. Otherwise, the owner could not eat the Pesach. So the feminine here may refer to that the circumcision is not only of males, but
we're talking about the potential femininity of the subject of the verb.
Exactly. Yes.
Not exactly. The subject of the verb, who's doing the circumcising. So let's go to the Rashi, because I've lost control. Yes, Larry.
No, but the question about whether it's must or not must.
Yeah.
So quickly just look at verse 48, because everyone agrees there in the translations, all three translations I'm looking at, that there is a must there. And the verb, I think, is himol with a darga, if Rick is there. And it's not, my Hebrew grammar is not good enough to say what the difference is, but they all agree that that there's a must circumcise there.
They agree it's a must. What it's not clear in verse 48 is the must connected to the va'az. He must, if then he's going to come close and do this with you, right? It's unclear if the obligation is to circumcise him or the obligation is to not let them eat until they've been circumcised. There's a must somewhere, but here I'll take it out of this context just to show you the different ways that the concept of must can exist. So there are different opinions as to what the obligation is to wear tzitzit. In the firm world, right? In the firm world, it was understood to be that you must wear a garment that has 4 corners with tzitzit on it, right? Talit katan. That's why in the tzitzis is worn, because it was understood to be a chovat gavra, an obligation on the person. You've got to wear that garment. But in the Talmud, it's clear that there's a machloket. Is this chovat gavra, an obligation of the person, or chovat mana? It's the obligation of the garment. If you're wearing a garment with 4 corners, it's got to have fringes. But I'm not saying you got to go out and purchase one, right? Which is why we put on the talit. We don't say al mitzvat tzitzit. We say lehita teif bat tzitzit. It's we're doing something ornamental to wrap ourselves in it, right? So there, the question is it that you have to buy this garment that has fringes on it? Or if you're having a garment with 4 corners, you have to put fringes on it. So is it that you have to circumcise him and then he can eat? Or if he wants to eat, he's got to be circumcised. There's a must somewhere there. Stevie.
This goes back to Larry's earlier point about this section being an insertion. The way Bible scholars look at this whole narrative is usually that there's at least 3 things pre-existing. There's a agricultural festival of matzah. There's a at-home ritual of a Korban Pesach, and there's the story of the Exodus. And then all three of these were at some point independent, and then various biblical or pre-biblical authors sought to integrate them to each other.
What was the first one you mentioned?
What an agricultural festival.
Right, Chag Haviv.
Right. So Chag HaMatzah, whatever. But yes. And then just in this section, if you go from the last, break in the text to the next break in the text, there's no mention of the Exodus of any kind, and there's no mention of matzah of any kind. It's all about this home ritual of a Korban Pesach, whatever that might have been, whether it was, some have suggested ancestor worship, someone suggested some sort of protection, right? The word Pesach implies maybe there's some sort of way to ward your house from evil spirits, whatever. It's, too many layers of crude over it to be certain what it might have been. But just, it's interesting to consider, right, sort of in isolation, what some, Korban Pesach might have meant.
Yeah. Let me share with you Everett Fox's translation of this verse, just to compare it to altar, right? So it's on the screen. But any man's serf, SERF, who is acquired for silver, if you have circumcised him, umaltauto, then he may eat it. So Everett Fox reads it as the must as being, this is the only circumstance in which he can eat of it. Absent the circumcision, he can't. Alter's reading it that the must is you've got to circumcise him. Two different ways of reading it. Unclear which one it is. Okay, let's go to the Rashi. Rebecca, you're still on from 74 minutes ago. And let's read the Rashi on verse 44. Please. Yes. And then we'll have everyone go around and respond to it.
Years ago, I went to a few seders with the Syrian family,
Mm.
and they did have a non-Jewish girlfriend over, and she had to leave the room for I don't
Wow.
know what part, but she did have to leave the room.
Yeah.
It was kind of-
Well, I think we mentioned last week that there are some people who are very religious about not inviting a non-Jew to Seder for this reason-ish. Rick, I see your hand up, so let's go.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I
One
just had a
second, Rick.
question.
Can you make that a little bit louder? Carl, I think you put the volume down, but we can't hear. Can you make it louder? Uh-huh. Speak loud, Rick.
Hi, can you hear me?
No.
Hello, hello? No?
Yeah, function key at the top that has volume up on.
Right at the top bar.
I can hear you.
Top right, right across the top.
Yeah, but they can't, maybe.
Loud speaker sign.
There you go.
All right, go ahead, Rick.
Just a detail on verse 44. So it says a slave of a man who was bought by money. How else could you be a slave to a person? Is there a function to miknat kasef? Is there a different kind of slave that wouldn't be purchased by money? That you inherited or some other way of? And again, why would the slaves coming out of Egypt have slaves themselves? So
Right.
anyway.
There are many ways in which someone could become a servant. The real question is, why is only the slave who is acquired by the purchase the one about whom this verse is talking, right? But yeah, you could become a slave servant because you had a debt that you had to pay back, right? That you were acquired by your debt as opposed to someone actually purchasing you, for lack of a better phrase, on the open market. But why here miknat kesef is so significant is unclear. Rashi doesn't go there. It doesn't mean that no one does, but Rashi doesn't go there. Okay, now let's read the Rashi. Rabo. Period. So first thing that Rashi has done is, in one word, is tell you that if you think you know what this verse means, you don't. Because who is the Yochalbo referring to according to Rashi? The owner, the master. Lest you think that the person, Hyro, we can't hear when they're speaking on Zoom. Can you just attach? It might be a speaker issue. The people on Zoom are very, very low. Thank you, Ro. Lest you think that the circumcision prevents the servant slave from eating. The absence of the circumcision prevents the master, right? Which is really a fascinating concept. We've kind of danced around it as if to say, you don't have the right to participate in this festival of freedom and Jewish identity. Stevie's comment notwithstanding about which festival we're actually talking about, put that aside. If it's not the case that everyone in your midst has been brought into the covenant, right? You don't have the right to just have a guest. There are no guests at this Seder. If there's a guest at the Seder, you can't eat of it, as it were. Keep going. Magid.
Can I just comment?
Yeah, of course.
Could it be that what's actually being said here is that if you, as a freed slave, actually bought a slave with money, the only way you can be included in our celebration is if you at least include your slave in our people or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a sweet, rosy, suchetzroni way of looking at it, because one could also say, you, the freed slave, yeah, once you forced your purchased slave to be a part of us, then you can eat of it, right? So there are several different ways of looking even at that, but yes, that's a possibility. Keep going.
Saying that the circumcision of his slaves stops him from eating the sacrifice. I assume that not circumcision.
Correct. The concept of the circumcision of your slavery, of your slave, is an impeding factor in your participation in the consumption of the Pesach offering, not just his. But Rashi will tell us he's basically just giving us the Mechilta in brief. According to one rabbi, Rabbi Yeshua says that's the thing, that this is getting in the way of the master's participation in the ritual.
Rabbi Eliezer אומר, אין מילת עבודה מהכפתור מלאכול בפסח. Rabbi Eliezer says the opposite, that the circumcision of slaves does not stop them from eating sacrifice.
The idea is that if you're a Jewish owner, an adult, you are obligated to eat the Korban Pesach whether or not you've got any slaves who have not been circumcised. 1 second, yes. Rick, just speak quickly so we can hear if we've fixed the issue.
Hello.
No.
Hi. No.
I don't think so. Carol, can you say a quick word?
I don't think it's my mic.
Testing. Hello.
No, it's just coming out of the
Yeah.
Speak again, Carol.
Hi.
More. Oh.
Hi.
I think we're just not amplifying their voices. All right, I don't want to waste the time on it. The Zoomers, we may not be able to incorporate your voice on this class as much as we normally would. Okay, keep going, Rebecca.
So Rabbi Eliezer says it doesn't stop him from eating. What it actually means is that yes, the slave has to be circumcised in order to eat.
Right. So essentially, Eliezer's answer to the question is, well, what then does the word "he shall not eat it" mean? And his answer is what we thought it meant originally, which is that the slave cannot eat unless he has been brought fully into the identity of the people in whose home he is now living. No one can hear you.
How does Rashi help us?
What do you mean? How does Rashi help us?
He doesn't suggest which interpretation is more likely to be correct.
Is Judaism all about answers, Larry? He helps you by deepening your understanding of the potential complexity of the text. And listen, what Rashi is doing is Rashi doesn't know what you, the reader, have as your first instinct as to what the verse means. So if your first instinct was that, of course, it means the Eved, he's saying there's another possibility. It could also mean that the owner can't eat of it if your Eved isn't circumcised, or vice versa. So you're right. He's not resolving it. Rashi is not a halachist, right? He's not the Rambam. He's not telling you that. Yeah, he's saying this is my understanding as to what the verse means or what the possibilities in the verse are. Right? Rashi wrote no code of Jewish law. Right? Bear, let's just push forward because I want to make sure make a little bit of progress here. So let's. Is there something else I wanted to share? Something from. Yeah, I want to share something from the Rambam. Let me just find it. Okay. Yeah. So the Rambam is a halachist, and I want to share with you his rendering of this rule. Okay, so this is Mishnah Torah, the Maimonides Code of Jewish Law, Hilchot Pesach, chapter 9. Okay. Can you see it up there? Keshem shemilat banav va'avadav ma'akavto mileshchot Pesach. Just like the circumcision or lack thereof of one's children or servants gets in the way of you, the owner, sacrificing Korban Pesach. Remember, Maimonides is writing this also including the reality of the temple existing and sacrificial system being back. Kach me'akavto milacho. It also prohibits you from actually eating of the Pesach, not just slaughtering it. Shenemar, as we learn, umalta oto, our verse, and if you should circumcise the person, az yochalpo, then you can eat of it. Ketzad, how? Kana eved achar shenishchat haPesach. Let's say you purchased a slave servant after the slaughtering of the Pesach, but before what? Eating it. Oh, shahayalo ben shalo higiyaz mano limo el achar shichat Pesach. Let's say your son's 8th day of life is in between the slaughtering of the Pesach and the eating of it. Hareza asur lecho ad shiyamul otan. You, the father/owner, cannot eat of the Pesach until you have circumcised them both, which means that Rambam halachically is weighing in on what we would consider to be the less obvious understanding of what the verse means, right? What were the two rabbis? He's weighing it halachically in Rabbi Yeshua's direction, that it's the owner's consumption, the owner's consumption that is imperiled by the lack of circumcision, not merely the servant slave, right? Because at some point, this had to be turned into Jewish law. As Larry said, that's not what Rashi thought of his raison d'etre. But that is what the Rambam thought. Okay, let's go to the next verse. We're on, because that's all that Rashi says in 44, and verse 45 is very short. Let's do some in the room because I'm not sure how good the Zoom audio is. Sue, do you want to read verse 45? Microphone. And a reminder of Larry's admonition that we should try to think of this in the flow of the verses in addition to what it means on its own.
Citizen and higher help won't eat of it.
Good. Okay. Toshav from the verb leshev, to dwell, not lashevet, to sit. They're probably related, but they're different verbs, right? So someone who is, citizen is interesting. Can you close the door, Norm? Sometimes it's translated as resident or resident alien, ger toshav. These categories cannot be fully disentangled. But someone who is near you in proximity, but for whatever reason is not fully of you. Visachir, someone who is hired help, right? Hired help from outside the community, lo yochabo, cannot eat of it. And what's implied in the verse is cannot eat of it until or unless either the person has been circumcised or the person has been circumcised for the purpose of joining your community, right? And that's what Rashi is going to get to in his comments. So, Sue, on Toshav.
The Gero Toshav, this is an alien resident.
Okay, so now the question is, what does Ger Toshav means? I want to share with you Rambam's answer for that as well. So I'm going to put that on the screen. Okay. Ezehu Ger Toshav. What is this category of a Ger Toshav? Someone who is living, dwelling, garing Toshav, in your settlement. Ze akum. Anyone know what akum means? Right. It's a catch. It literally meant someone who worships stars and constellations, but it ended up being a catch-all for heathen, non-Jew, not necessarily an idolater, right? But a heathen, a non-Jew, shekibel alav, who accepted upon himself, shalo yavod avodah zorah, said, you know what, I'm not going to do idolatry. Im sha'ar hamitzvot shenitztavu bnei Noach, and I'll hold myself to the other of the mitzvot that we Jews think that even non-Jews are obligated to, called the 7 Noachai laws, right? Not eating Ever min achai, not eating food from a living animal, flesh from a living animal, do not murder, things like that, okay? So let's say you've got someone saying, I'm not willing to convert, but I'm willing to surrender some of my privileges as a non-Jew. I'm not going to do idolatry, and I'm going to stay away from other Noachai prohibitions. Velomal, but did not circumcise himself, did not go through that last barrier. Velo taval, now he's throwing in kind of rabbinic notions of conversion into this concept, and didn't go to the mikvah. We got nothing about mikvah in our verses, so he's, right? Harezem mikablinoto, you accept that person. Vehumi chasidei umot olam. That person becomes one of the most righteous of the nations of the world. What is that person not? A Jew. The person is not a Jew. It's okay. He's chosen not to. But he's also not just like all the other goyim. I'm using kind of language that Maimonides might have used in our vernacular, because he's agreed to some restrictions in order to live among you. Velama nikra shmo toshav. Why then is he called a toshav, a dweller? Lefi shemutar lanu, because it's permitted to us, lahoshivo benenu, to permit him to grant him dwelling amongst us, be'eretz Yisrael, land of Israel, kamosha be'arnu b'hilchot akum, as we taught above. So if we thrust the Rambam into Rashi, into this verse, we're saying, let's say you've got someone, you okay? Yeah. Let's say you've got someone who is not among you, but has agreed to the less severe restrictions, but still some restrictions of living amongst you. Even then, what can the person not do? Korban Pesach. Because
does he say, is this Rambam referring to this verse, or just in general referring to Toshav?
This halacha is referring to Gerber Toshav. But yes, else, but right, it would apply to the rule in this verse, right? So if you have agreed to that restriction, you can be amongst us. We praise you for being Chasidei Umot Olam. Korban Pesach, go have pizza, because you're not eating with us. Okay? Rashi on Vesachir, who is reading? Sue?
Vesachir, Zegboy.
Zehagoy meaning we're not referring to a Jewish person who you've hired, because you say, obviously, if you've hired a Jewish person to be your sachir, of course they can eat. But if you have a day laborer or a week laborer amongst you, which is different than Gever Toshav, because a Toshav is someone who is perpetually with you. But let's say you have someone who's there for a short period who happens to be not Jewish. Go ahead.
What's the Talmud say?
Talmud here doesn't mean Talmud. It basically he's using the language that would be used in the Midrash. What then is it coming to teach us? Meaning, what's the chiddush? What's the innovation here? After all, the hello. What does Arelim He mean? Uncircumcised. Right. So Rashi says, wait a second. What's this verse telling us? If you have a non-Jewish sachir and a non-Jewish toshav, and we're saying they can't eat of the Korban Pesach, what's the novelty in that? They're not circumcised. And then it says, Ukfar v'ne'amar, and it says, this is verse 48. We haven't gotten there yet, but just turn ahead to verse 48, right? Towards the end of the section that Larry's been asking us to read as a unit, right? So I'll read it quickly. V'chiagurid hager, if you have a stranger amongst you, v'asa pesach ladonai, and the person, there are a lot of different ways of translating this verse, I know quickly, wants to participate in the Pesach, himolo kol zachar, you should sacrifice all the males, va'az yikrav lasoto, and then the person can come close to do it. V'hayak ezracha aretz, and that person will be like a citizen of the land. And a reminder, v'chol arel lo yochal bo, any uncircumcised person can't eat of it. So Rashi says, if we're about to learn that any circumcised person can eat it, why do we have to be told that a subset of uncircumcised people, a toshav and a ger, can't eat of it? The answer is, I mean, you would say, it's obvious. We know he can't. So therefore, what is it teaching us? Ella. Okay. What we're talking about is the very circumstance that Norm was speaking about before. What if you've got an Aravi Mahul? A circumcised Arab, or a Giboni Mahul, a circumcised Gibeonite. Long story. We can go into who the Gibeonites were and what their status was vis-a-vis the Jewish people. They were near us. They had some rituals that were associated with us. They were not us. They circumcised themselves. So let's say you've got a Rambam's definition of a ger, who has agreed to not participate in idolatry, and there are no Noachide laws, who happens to be circumcised because they're an Arab or a Gibeonite. What can the person not do? Right. Because this circumcision, this blood, has to be in the name of joining our people. Right? They would need hatafat dam brit, as it were. We're mixing lots of layers of Jewish thought in this, right? We've got the pure biblical layer, which, as Stevie pointed out, even the pure biblical layer is layered, plus all the rabbinic material that created the concept of conversion, plus Maimonides going backwards in time to imagine how sacrificial laws would obtain in our era and generation. And all of it is trying to kind of, to use your image, Sue, of Michelangelo, of like carve out or reveal, what is this ritual? What is its significance to our people in perpetuity? Why, who's in and who's out, and why is it so important to determine who's in and who's out on this night, right? We can look askance at those who take a more absolutist view and would not invite someone to their Seder who's not Jewish, right? I don't support that as a decision as a host, but I do understand the concept that through 2,000 years more of development of the idea, this was a night for determining without apology and without subtlety, who's in, who's out, who is observing this ritual as a part of us for the same reasons we are, not just because they're curious, and who's not. And if you're not, okay, but you don't get to be a part of our chabura tonight. Right? One second, Barry. So all of, and we're going to now have an unhelpful interruption because we've gotten through verse 45, and I think we read all the Rashi in verse 45. We're in the middle of the verses that Larry wants to see us as a unit, and then I will not be teaching this class for a few weeks because the Africa trip begins on Sunday. So I will put in the WhatsApp chat, I think, which classes, which dates Leonard is able to teach, and then we'll pick up on this when I get back. And just kind of a bittersweet reminder that when I get back, I think we only have 3 Wednesdays before my sabbatical begins. So we're going to be, well, hopefully we'll get through at least these verses before we take that break. Yes, Barry. Of the 28th is the next time I will be teaching, but I'll put it in the WhatsApp group.
So there are parts of this the Seder. There's the ritual, telling the story and eating the matzah, and the non-circumcised people are not prevented from any of that part of it. The only part that they're prevented from, or depending on whose story it is, the owner of the house is prevented, is eating of the Pesach.
Right, but the word "only" there should be in quotation marks, because when these verses were being spoken of, that was not just only, that was all. That was the ritual. So what we have as a Seder is a replacement for this. So the implication might be that since they couldn't do this then, whatever we do now instead of this, which is the Seder, is what they're prohibited from doing, which is why some Jews will not allow a non-Jew at their Seder, because that was the ritual, wasn't part of the ritual. It was the entirety of the ritual. Have a good Wednesday, everybody.
You've been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast website or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Temple Beth Am, Los Angeles, please visit www.tbala.org.